Welcome to this session on My Retina Tracker Registry and Open Access Genetic Testing. I'm Brian Mansfield, the Executive Vice President for Research and the Interim Chief Scientific Officer of the Foundation Fighting Blindness. And it's my pleasure to introduce our presenters today. First, Kari Branham. Kari is a clinical assistant professor and genetic counselor at the Kellogg Eye Center in Michigan. Following graduation from the University of Michigan in 2002, Kari joined the Ophthalmic Genetics Research Group at the University of Michigan and has served as the director of the Retinal and Macular Dystrophies Family Studies Core. Kari also works as a clinical genetic counselor for the Inherited Retinal Dystrophies Clinic. She supervises students during clinical rotations and has been a mentor for multiple student research projects. Our second presenter is Karmen Truzpek. Karmen is the Director, Ocular and Rare Disease Genetic Services and Clinical Trial Services at Informed DNA. Karmen has been a certified genetic counselor since 2005 and holds a Master of Science in Genetic Counseling from Northwestern University and a Bachelor of Science in Microbiology from the University of Illinois. Before working with Informed DNA, Karmen was a genetic counselor at the KCI Institute at Oregon Health and Sciences University. Karmen, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I'm going to start out by providing just a little bit of an overview of what Kari and I would like to discuss with you today regarding genetic testing and genetic counseling through the MRT genetic testing program. So as an overview, part one of this conversation is going to be about the basics of the genetics of inherited retinal disease and the impact of both genetic testing and then genetic counseling, and then some barriers that we know exist to patients obtaining genetic testing. I will then turn it over to Kari, who is going to provide an introduction to My Retina Tracker Registry and discuss the sponsored genetic testing program through the Foundation Fighting Blindness, and provide some results that we're seeing through that program, some outcomes, and then give you a sense of how you can participate in this program. So just a little bit of background to level set. When we talk about genetic testing, sometimes people can have a little confusion around exactly what's being tested. So let's start big and go small. We all have trillions of cells in our bodies. Within every single cell is a set of chromosomes. Most of us know there are 23 pair of chromosomes. This is what a set of normal female chromosomes look like. Our chromosomes are in pairs, and they are identical pairs except for the last two chromosomes, the X and the Y. So you can see here that this is a female. She has two X chromosomes. If this was a male chromosome set, there would be one X and one Y. And that becomes important when we think about how some of these conditions are inherited.
Karmen, I'm going to stop you because I don't see your slides.
Oh, Lord. I think I hit share screen and then there's like a tell me when you're ready.
No.
Okay. So to level set, we all have trillions of cells in our bodies. And within every single cell, we have a set of chromosomes. And most of us know that we have 23 pair of chromosomes. And what you're looking at here is a set of normal female chromosomes. There are 23 pair, as you can see identified here, numbered 1 through 22. And then the last pair, because this is a woman, there are two X chromosomes. If this was a male set of chromosomes, there would be one X and one Y. And that becomes important when we think about how some of these conditions are inherited, that we don't all have the exact same chromosomes. There's that difference between men and women. Now within each chromosome, there are long, long strands of DNA which are separated into genes. And so when we look at genes in a genetic testing laboratory, they're looking way down at this level, at the gene level. So they're not looking under a microscope at the chromosomes. They're looking at this gene level. And what they're looking for is they're looking at that normal sort of read of the gene. And that's made up of these four letters, G, T, C, and A. And every single gene we have is made up of a sequence of just those 4 base pairs represented by those letters. And even the change of one tiny little letter, here you can see a change from a C to a T, can completely disrupt the way that that gene is normally read, and therefore what that gene is supposed to do. Our genes normally encode proteins, which do all kinds of things for our bodies, and in the retina, those genes encode things like structural proteins that form the basis of how our retina is layered and structured. They also form proteins that do things like metabolic functions in the retina. So this is really the crux of genetic testing, is finding these errors within the genetic code. Now, how does genetic testing benefit the patient? There are a number of ways, and we've known these for a long time, that genetic testing really benefits patients. We can get a more accurate clinical diagnosis in patients through genetic testing, and that more accurate diagnosis information can then provide us with better prognosis information, meaning how are you likely to do in the course of your disease as a result of this condition. We can rule in or rule out syndromic disease. And what I mean by that is that many, many times inherited retinal diseases are a standalone condition. RP is usually a standalone condition. Someone with RP doesn't have other health problems associated with it. But sometimes people can have a genetic syndrome and have multiple health problems as a result of that. And then they can also help determine surveillance. So in the case of that syndromic disease, there might be different things that your doctor wants to watch out for and be mindful of that you could develop. Genetic testing certainly helps us to determine the accurate inheritance, which can improve the way that we provide genetic counseling to families regarding who else in the family might be at risk, who else in the family might be a good candidate to undergo testing. We can identify other individuals in the family to evaluate clinically. And then, of course, I think what most of the excitement and interest is around genetic testing more recently, certainly within the last 3 to 5 years, has been the therapeutic implications. That there is today one approved gene therapy and a number of clinical trials ongoing and in development that patients might qualify for. And then lastly, I've noted here that we also see increased patient engagement. I've had many, many families tell me over the years, I'm guessing that Kari has as well, that it was really powerful to find out what gene was the cause of the condition in their family, to understand that better, to know what parts of the research to pay more attention to reach out to other families who have a very similar experience. So what I'd like to do is give you a couple of examples of these benefits. Here's one about diagnosis. So this is a patient who I counseled. This patient had night blindness in late childhood, had noted that they had had multiple concussions in their early teenage years, mostly due to poor peripheral vision and depth perception they felt. Diagnosed with RP at the age of 13, and was legally blind at the age of 16, so fairly rapid progression from the time they were diagnosed to legal blindness. Now, in taking an additional history from this patient, I found that the family indicated that she had experienced learning disabilities throughout childhood. She had a seizure history in early childhood, but had seemingly outgrown that. Had recurrent urinary tract infections in infancy, so a few things, not anything really obvious and dramatic, and had always struggled with weight, has a current BMI of 25. So here's this patient's family history. As genetic counselors, we take a full family history from every one of our patients. Here's this patient down here. The circle indicates that she's a girl. This is her brother. These are her parents, as you're trying to decipher what this family tree means. And as you can see, there's nobody else in her family who we've colored in with this pink in this case, and indicating that they also have RP. So she's the only one in her family known to be affected. And here are her genetic test results. So her test results come back, and it turns out that her test results were positive for 2 mutations in the BBS1 gene. Now there's a little bit of difference in terminology here. On the test report, it says that she has 1 pathogenic variant and 1 likely pathogenic variant. That basically means that these are disease-causing, and we would consider that to be positive and what most people would call a mutation. Each of those is a mutation. This BBS1 gene is associated traditionally with a condition that we call Bardet-Biedl syndrome. And this condition, Bardet-Biedl syndrome, really explains some of the history that she's had, particularly with regard to the learning disabilities and her struggles with her weight. But importantly, probably more importantly, it also tells us some of the things that she could potentially develop later in her life. And so after we discuss these test results, we always make sure to provide the family and the doctor with these recommendations so that they know how to follow her to ensure that they're staying on top of these other complications she can develop, such as impaired liver function or impaired kidney function. I also talked about inheritance being an important reason why genetic testing can be impactful. You know, I love this study. It was done quite a while ago, and I'm sure Kari didn't know I was going to put this in the slide, but it's a study that came out of her work at the University of Michigan. So I feel that this made it very, very clear to all of us that we need to be humble when we think about our ability to provide really accurate genetic counseling to families without genetic testing. What they did is they did a retrospective study. So they looked back on their patients with RP, and they compared the inheritance type that they believed the patient had based on their clinical diagnosis and on their family history versus the results of genetic testing. So they compared that to see, like, you know, were they right? And what they found was 10% of patients had a different inheritance based on genetic testing than what they had believed based on clinical and family history. And this is one of the most elite centers in the world that does this work. So if they're wrong 10% of the time, that's something really important for all of us to consider and remember that genetic testing can teach us a lot. Now, sometimes people want to know why. Why is that? Why can genetic testing tell us this answer so definitively when this specialist, this team of specialists at the center didn't? And here's why. We see some discrepancies in what we think is happening versus what's really happening for a number of reasons. So this is a family tree, or what we would call a pedigree, of classic dominant inheritance. In a dominantly inherited condition like dominant RP, what we typically see is that one person in the family will start at the top here with great-grandfather. This person had RP. Here are his 2 children below him, and one of them is affected, one isn't. And that's typical for dominant RP. It doesn't always happen that way. Just because your first child is affected doesn't mean your next one won't be. These are just averages, like flipping a coin each time, or like having girls and boys. Just because they had a girl the first time doesn't mean that they would have a boy the second time. But in this case, that's what happened. The first child was affected, the second one wasn't. And so you can see this through the family, that anyone who's affected has a 50-50 chance every time they have a child of having a child who's affected. So each of these filled in individuals went on to develop RP. But it turns out that dominant inheritance doesn't always look like this. Sometimes it looks like this. Sometimes what we find is that there are only a few people in the family who actually develop RP, even though there are others in the family who inherited the genetic mutation. And we call this reduced penetrance, meaning not everyone who inherits the condition will develop it. If we look at recessive inheritance, here's a very typical family with recessively inherited RP. Down here, these 2 siblings, brother and sister, are both affected. Their other brother is not. The little circles in their parents above indicate that they're carriers. So in a recessively inherited disease, our understanding is that both parents are carriers, meaning that they each have 1 normal copy of the gene, and one copy that carries that genetic mutation. They each have a chance of passing that on, and when a child inherits both genetic mutations, they develop the condition. This is what we normally see with recessive inheritance. But this can also be recessive inheritance. Sometimes what we see is that someone who's affected can marry someone who happens to be a carrier for that same condition, and then there's a higher likelihood that their children will be affected. So on the surface of it, at a glance, this doesn't look like recessive RP, but in fact it can be. And then lastly, if we look at X-linked inheritance, this is a typical family history where we see X-linked inheritance. In X-linked RP, for example, what we expect to see is that the women in the family are carriers, and anytime a woman is a carrier, she has a 50-50 chance of passing that to one of her sons. So here, our patient, the one with the arrow, is affected, and he has a couple of male cousins who are also affected, and they're all related through the women in the family. This is very classic for X-linked inheritance. But sometimes X-linked inheritance can look like this. Particularly in some forms of X-linked RP, we actually see that many women go on to develop RP. So sometimes even in an X-linked condition where we think classically women don't develop X-linked conditions, sometimes they do, and particularly in X-linked RP. So hopefully that gives you an idea of why just looking at a family history and diagnosis can't always tell us what the inheritance is in the family. And to provide you with a quick example of this, here's a patient of mine. This patient of mine was referred after at the age of 13, having some very, very slight vision problems. Could only correct to 20/25 in one eye, 20/30 in the other. Developed some foveal cysts, meaning like little pockets in the fovea, which is right in the middle of the macula in the center of the retina. No reported night blindness or color vision loss at that point. And this patient was referred with a diagnosis of juvenile X-linked retinoschisis. You don't have to know what all of that means, but hopefully you do know what X-linked means after we just talked about that. So here's that patient's family history. Now, there are no other males in the family affected, and that doesn't exclude the possibility of X-linked inheritance. Maybe just by chance, none of the other males in the family inherited that genetic mutation. But here are his genetic test results, and it turns out it's not X-linked at all. It turns out that his condition is related to this gene CRB1. This is recessive. He has 2 genetic mutations. And so it turns out that in this case, genetic testing helped to determine the correct inheritance and diagnosis. Very important for this family. And so lastly, if you go back and you think about the reasons that I provided for the importance of genetic testing, it's qualification for gene-based therapies. And when I say gene-based therapies, I think that's confusing sometimes to people, so I threw together this little chart. A gene-based therapy would be anything where we need to know the underlying genetic cause of disease in order for someone to qualify. That would include gene therapy, CRISPR, antisense oligonucleotide therapy. What's not gene-based would be like retina chips, implants. Most stem cell therapies, there are rare cases where that's not true, but most stem cell therapies are not gene-based. Most dietary supplementation is not gene-based. So there are some clinical trials that may be available to some patients without genetic testing, but most of the clinical trials in inherited retinal disease, you need to know the underlying genetic cause of disease in order to qualify. Here's a patient of mine, and I think that this is such a good reminder of why the type of testing that's being done right now through the Foundation Fighting Blindness program is so important. Looking at this family history with all these people affected with very early onset inherited retinal disease, this would seem like this is probably a dominant condition. And 10 years ago, if we were doing genetic testing for this patient, we would probably just order testing of the dominantly inherited RP genes at that time. But now we do this large panel testing. Essentially, we don't have any preconceived notions about what might be causing it. We just ask the question, what is causing it? And it turns out that this patient was positive for RPE65. And if you go back, you think, wait a second, RPE65, isn't that Luxturna? It is. So this patient actually ended up qualifying for Luxturna and having conversation with his sisters about that as well. And if you look at that, what happened here is this family actually came from one very, very small ethnic community in Central America where there's a higher prevalence of this particular genetic mutation, and both sides of the family had it. So a rare event to be sure, but one where I think it's so important today that we're doing this testing on everybody and not just those who we think are the right candidates. So given all that, we all know that genetic testing is very important, and yet many people aren't getting it. And why is that? The number one reason is that insurance doesn't always cover it. That's been a problem for a long time, particularly in adults who have a diagnosis of RP where the insurance company feels that the clinical diagnosis alone is sufficient and genetic testing wouldn't change medical management. Well, if you're not going to go through insurance, many people want to know, well, maybe I should just pay for it on my own, but the cost is pretty prohibitive for most families. There is time involved from the retina specialist to know what kind of testing to order and to be able to really sit down and understand the results and then sit down with patients and families and explain those results. So for a lot of busy retina specialists who are very engaged and interested in doing genetic testing for their families, this is a barrier, just finding enough time in their clinic to do that well. And then there's this burden of travel for patients getting to the large academic research institutes. And so all of these factors really led to the Foundation Fighting Blindness looking at how can we step in and how can we ensure that genetic testing becomes available for patients who we serve, and how can we really take into account these barriers and make sure that we overcome them. And obviously I'm biased here, but I really applaud them for not only thinking about genetic testing, but genetic counseling as a component of this. National guidelines support genetic counseling when genetic testing is being performed, both broadly in genetic disease as well as specifically by the American Academy of Ophthalmology. And it's really something that the foundation has been incredibly supportive of to ensure that families not only get access to the testing, but to somebody who can really sit down with them and help them understand the test results. And hopefully I've given you an example throughout this, several examples of how this is really about putting all the pieces together. It's really about pulling together medical history, pulling together family history, pulling together the test results, and then taking time to do that interpretation. And so with that, I am going to stop sharing so that I can hand it over to Kari. I think. Hold on, Kari, and I will stop sharing.
Thanks so much to Karmen for giving a fantastic overview of thinking about the reasons why we do genetic testing. And I'm going to kind of elaborate on one of the things that she introduced as a topic there. And one of them was that the Foundation Fighting Blindness has kind of put in place some genetic testing programs to help patients get access to genetic testing. So in order to talk a little bit more about that, I need to give you a little bit of background first, because the genetic testing programs that have been set up have been done so in the context of the My Retina Tracker Registry. And this is something that many patients may be familiar with and some may not. So if you think about what the mission of the Foundation Fighting Blindness is to drive the research that will lead to preventions, treatments, and vision restorations for degenerative retinal diseases. So along those lines, they have developed the My Retina Tracker Registry. So My Retina Tracker Registry is a patient informed database that collects information about people that are affected with retinal degenerative diseases. So this is information about demographic information, health information, of course, ophthalmic information, and genetic information. And all of this information goes together into their patient-driven registry that they have, the online secure registry. And that allows the Foundation Fighting Blindness and scientific researchers to look at this information. It is a really informative tool for people to learn more about these conditions, the way that they affect people, and the genetic basis for disease in those individuals. So currently, there is nearly 16,000 members of the registry. There is genetic testing results that is available on more than half of them. And a lot of those genetic testing results are due to the programs that the foundation has put in place. There's a huge number of new people that are enrolling in the research, up to 300 new members every month. If we look at the composition of the registry, it's mainly about nearly 50% is patients that are affected with retinitis pigmentosa, but fairly represented by some of the other conditions. Usher syndrome, Stargardt disease tend to be some of the more common conditions. But really this reaches across all of the different diagnoses that we see for patients affected with retinal degenerative diseases. So this is a slide that actually Karmen had presented earlier that just talks about some of the barriers that we see in patients getting genetic testing. Really, if any patients want to be involved in a lot of the clinical trials that are gene-based, and also if they want to have some of the information regarding inheritance, you have to get genetic testing done. But it's not available for everybody. So the foundation had worked on different programs in order to help people gain access to genetic testing and overcome some of these barriers. So one of the things that they did, this was back in 2017, FFB created a research study that is associated with the My Retina Tracker registry. So basically, healthcare providers who were seeing patients and approved as study providers could talk to their patients about enrolling into the My Retina Tracker registry and then qualifying for genetic testing at no cost through the study. This research study is actually still enrolling patients. I know I enroll patients from my own institution at the University of Michigan. But was a little bit challenging for some patients who maybe their provider was not approved as someone who could send samples registry. So in order to kind of overcome that information, Foundation Fighting Blindness in October 2019 developed an open access genetic testing program. Basically, same lab, same genetic test, same access to genetic counselors. I didn't mention that, but through the My Retina Tracker genetic testing study, all participants were provided with genetic counseling. This could be genetic counselors locally, such as myself, providing genetic counseling for my patients, or if a provider, a healthcare provider, an ophthalmologist didn't have a genetic counselor at their institution, then they could send them to Inform DNA, that is Karmen and her colleagues, who would provide remote telemedicine genetic counseling for the patients. So that is something that continues to be available to patients who participate in the open access genetic testing program. For people who are involved in the open access genetic testing program, they're not required to join My Retina Tracker, but we're kind of encouraging people to do so because all of the information that they can share, it helps the researchers and also helps to stay engaged. Through these two different programs, the Genetic Testing Research Study and the Open Access Genetic Testing Program, more than 7,700 individuals have had genetic testing done, which is awesome. This really kind of eliminates some of the barriers that we see in order for people to get genetic testing done. We actually had done a little study looking at our own patient population in the year before we started doing the My Retina Tracker genetic testing study and the year after. And there were significant differences in our patients' ability to have genetic testing done before and after implementation of the My Retina Tracker genetic testing study. And of course, the fact that the genetic testing study and the open access genetic testing program are both at no cost to patients is huge at eliminating that as a barrier for patients. So who is eligible to participate in the My Retina Tracker open access program? It's patients that are diagnosed with eligible diagnoses. This includes the retinal degenerative diseases such as RP, Stargardt disease, Usher syndrome. There actually is a whole long list, and I didn't want to list them all here, but you can get additional information on the website. But the really vast majority of patients that are affected with these retinal degenerative diseases, their diagnoses are typically eligible. The patients also have to live in the United States, and you have to have not already had a broad, by broad we mean more than 32 genes done on a genetic testing panel since 2016. And again, there's a little bit more information on the Foundation Fighting Blindness website. You just have to click on the button that's about genetic testing to give you further details about all of this. So how do you participate in this program? The genetic testing must be ordered through a healthcare provider. This could be an ophthalmologist, a retina specialist, a genetic counselor who is local to you. Some of these healthcare providers already know about this open access program, but if you don't, you can inform them about it and say, hey, this is a way that I can get genetic testing done at no cost. The patient will have to sign an informed consent document that kind of outlines the information, who the data is being shared with, and how the genetic testing process is done. The sample will be collected, typically a saliva sample, and sent for genetic testing on a 322 gene panel. That's what the panel is currently. In the past, it's a little bit smaller, but it's been growing over time. The results will come back. They'll be returned to the ordering healthcare provider. And again, genetic counseling is available for all participants through Informed DNA, or it could be through a local genetic counselor if you have one. Patients are encouraged but not required to register for the My Retina Tracker registry. Again, really this is exciting because there's no cost to the patient or their insurance company for this genetic testing to be done. So I've already mentioned a little bit that genetic counselors, also as Karmen had said, genetic counselors are a huge part of genetic testing. We're very valuable resources for helping patients to understand a lot of the information that goes along with this. If anyone meets with the genetic counselors through Informed DNA, there'll be a review of the clinical and vision history, complete family history will be obtained, and then a review of the genetic testing results in light of the family history. So Karmen had given a couple of examples of patients where it's really important to have all of this information, have the family history information, have the additional information about what's going on in medical history in order to fully understand the patient and what is going on with them. There'll be a discussion then about the meaning of the test results, implications for other members of the family, opportunities for different clinical treatment trials if they are going on, medical management, and recommended follow-up for these patients. So this information is something that some ophthalmologists and healthcare providers will discuss with patients. But honestly, as Karmen mentioned, one of the limitations that goes along with this is all a very time-consuming process. And not all ophthalmologists and retina specialists have the time and may not have the knowledge to be able to provide you with all of this information. So this kind of highlights the importance of genetic testing. And again, as Karmen had said, really applauding the Foundation Fighting Blindness for integrating genetic counselors into this sort of testing program. In addition, it is often discussed with patients about the enrollment in the My Retina Tracker registry. That is something that the genetic counselors who worked with Informed DNA will do with patients. And they can also provide them with information on updated test results. This is actually something that we see very commonly, that will be provided with additional information about the genetic testing results as maybe the lab does additional testing with patients. So I wanted to take a second and just kind of talk to you a little bit about some of the information that we've gathered from these different testing programs that are done. Specifically, I've been analyzing the data from the My Retina Tracker genetic testing study. There's been more than 6,500 participants now. I was analyzing data on about 6,000 of those participants. So really a very large study, one of the largest studies that's looking at patients that are affected with retinal degenerative diseases. And so just to highlight a little bit of that, the genetic cause was identified in nearly 60% of the proband. And the proband is just the first person in a family that's affected with this condition. So if we just look from a family standpoint, that's really necessary to understand the detection rate. So we were seeing about 60% of families, we were able to identify the genetic cause of disease in the families. That information did vary based on what the diagnosis of the patient was. For example, the highest detection rate, 83%, was seen in those patients affected with syndromic conditions. So that would be things like Usher syndrome, Bardet-Biedl condition, where there's more than one organ system that's affected. The lowest detection rate, about 49%, was in those patients with a cone or a cone rod dystrophy. So honestly, all of this together provides the scientists, provides the researchers with a lot of information about what does disease look like in this community overall. It also tells us that in some of these conditions, we have a ways to go. We're still trying to understand more about different genetic conditions and the genetic causes in those families. Part of the other information that we're gaining, we already knew some of this, that this is, when we think about retinal degenerative diseases, we call them very diverse. So genotypically and phenotypically very complicated. What we mean by that is there are many different ways that people are affected with these conditions and many different genetic causes for these conditions. So what we saw out of the study, from looking at these approximately 6,000 people affected, is there was 177 different genetic causes of disease identified within the family. And this is actually, the graph that I'm showing here is actually just showing the number of families in which the gene was caused in at least 20 families. So we have some of the genes of those 177 genes, really there was only one or two families. Those are the less common ones. At the other end, we have this more common group of them. So the top 5 genes, which is ABCA4, USH2A, RPGR, PRPH2, and rhodopsin, accounts for nearly 50% of these families. So those are definitely the more common, but this spreads out to the very not quite as common conditions. And one of the important reasons that we think about doing genetic testing is we want to identify patients who might be eligible for different treatment trials. So there are more than 1,000 patients that were identified in which there is some treatment or trial which is going on at this time for patients that are affected with these conditions. So that's fantastic that through this study, we were able to help that many people get the genetic basis for their eye disease understood, and maybe there is some treatment that they may be eligible for. So this is a quote, and actually Karmen had helped me with this quote, but it was a patient who was told, or who had said, I was told that genetic testing wasn't important for me. Then I found the study, and now look, this genetic testing has answered questions for me that I never would have had otherwise. I started out frustrated that I did not qualify for gene therapy, but now I'm so grateful for everything that I've learned about my disease. This has given me hope. And so this is just one example of a patient who was really grateful for their participation in these studies. So just to summarize, I think that Karmen really did a great job of highlighting that genetic testing is important for patients affected with retinal degenerative diseases. There are actually many different ways that you can have genetic testing done going with insurance and self-pay, but Foundation Fighting Blindness has resources available in the form of the genetic testing research study and their open access program that can help get this genetic testing done. Another important part that I would highlight is really working with a genetic counselor to help through this process can be really valuable to helping you to understand more about this. And as my final plug, just consider joining the MRT registry. It is helpful. It is really helpful for the foundation and furthering the mission of understanding these conditions by joining that registry. So that is it for me.
Thank you, Kari. Thank you, Karmen, for your wonderful presentations. And just to remind people that if they do want to learn more about genetic testing, they can go to the Foundation's website, which is fightingblindness.org, and there they'll find information about genetic testing and the registry. If you want to go directly to the registry, then just type the name of the registry, My Retina Tracker myretinatracker.org. One word, myretinatracker.org, and it'll take you to the site where you can log on and create a membership. Well, we do have a few questions that have been submitted, if you could answer. The first one comes from a person who says, my brother and I both have RP. Rather than double recessive, he learned he was XLRP, RPGR. Would you recommend that I be retested? What would be the process?
I can go.
You can go.
So it depends. We were, based on the question, it sounds like probably you either haven't had genetic testing done, or you've had some genetic testing done which was maybe negative or didn't show the same result as what your brother was shown to have. And it does kind of, you know, over time the genetic tests evolve. And so it's possible that maybe you weren't tested originally for the same genetic cause, and maybe that's why it wasn't identified. But absolutely, if you have an inconclusive test result or something that is different than what was found originally, then I think it absolutely would be beneficial. And so as Brian had just mentioned, there's some resources out there for how you can have the genetic testing done that may be helpful.
Thank you. The second question that we've received is, if test results can be difficult to decipher, should you get a second or third opinion regarding your test results? And it's not quite clear to me here whether the person has been told they have found the cause or whether it's an uncertain outcome from the testing.
We can take turns if you want, Kari.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah.
I will just take turns. So, Brian, as you said, it's a little hard to tell exactly what they mean here, but maybe that's okay, because let's extrapolate to what probably impacts many people. And that is that sometimes genetic testing can be done and there can be these uncertain findings. So I showed a couple of test reports where it said that the genetic variant identified was pathogenic or likely pathogenic. And I told you that that really equates to mutation. I tell patients that, right? Pathogenic equals mutation. You're more used to the term mutation. Same thing. But what that means is that there was a variation in the genetic code that was identified, and we have a lot of data that proves that that's associated with disease. That's not always the case. Sometimes there's a genetic variant identified by the lab, and we don't have very much data about it, and we don't know for certain, does this cause disease, or is this just normal variation in the gene? Like, we all have differences in our fingerprints, and that's not good or bad. It's just different. We all have differences. So I think this question about whether or not someone with that kind of uncertainty should be retested really gets back to a little bit of Kari's response just now, which is kind of about when that testing was done before, where that testing was done before, and what the actual results are. So if you've had results, if you've had testing done before and you're wondering if you should be retested or if you can be retested, through this program, if you haven't been tested using a big test since 2016, you qualify. So if your prior test results were uncertain or inconclusive, and you were tested under a research program, or you were tested using a very small test of maybe only 6 or 10 genes or something, now might be a great time to be retested because our testing is a lot better. However, if you were tested last year using this same exact panel test and the results were uncertain, getting retested now wouldn't provide anybody any benefit because the laboratory continues to gather additional data. They continue to reevaluate these variants. Your genetic variation isn't going to change. Our understanding of it is going to change. And if our understanding changes, we'll let you know. We'll recontact people in the future as we learn more and more about what these variants mean.
Thank you, Karmen. Another question that came in, I think, is related to that answer that you've just given. If someone has Usher syndrome, but once tested, the counselors comment they had never seen the mutation before. However, they provide a diagnosis of USH1D. How can they make this determination if they've never seen the mutation before?
So I think it kind of plays to, it may not be actually that just the genetic counselor has never seen that. It's possible new genetic changes are being identified all the time. And the lab will use a lot of different sources of information to try to determine if this genetic cause is disease causing, so a mutation, or if it's just a part of that normal variation that we all have. So the sources of information that we have are, there are computer databases out there that contain people who are not believed to have eye disease. You would expect to not see those genetic changes in that population or see them at a very low frequency. They look to the literature, so other publications of people that are affected with this eye disease or a condition like Usher syndrome, and you might expect that you could see some other patients that have those genetic mutations. You also can use computer models for the effect on the gene of whether or not it is the cause of disease or not. So if we have all of those information, it's kind of adding up points of, do we have enough information to suggest that this is the cause of disease in a particular patient or not? So sometimes, depending on if it hasn't been seen in other patients, then they may not know for sure whether it is, whereas sometimes based on the type of genetic change, so that would be the effect that the genetic change or genetic mutation has on the gene, sometimes we can say, even though we haven't seen it before, this would be the type of change that we would expect to be disease causing. So it's hard to know without knowing the specifics of the report, but I think that's probably what they were talking about, the fact that, okay, we haven't seen this, but there is some evidence to suggest from some of these different computer modeling or the type of genetic change that would lead them to believe that this is the cause of disease within that patient.
Thank you, Kari. The final question we had is, I'm affected. Should I have my child tested?
That one gets to come to me, huh? That's fine. That's fine. I'll take it. Okay. I think that there are a couple of different factors we need to take into account when we answer this question. This is not a yes or no answer. It's very dependent upon the condition, the age of onset of that condition, and the age of the child. If you are a 35-year-old who is affected with adult onset RP and you want to know whether or not to test your 6-year-old, we would say no. This is something that we would not want to do pre-symptomatic testing for a child when we don't have any intervention. We don't have anything we would do differently. However, you know, maybe you are concerned about an earlier onset condition and your child is already showing some concerning signs of reduced night vision, and you think, gosh, should I just get them tested? Like, I'm so worried because it seems like she just doesn't see as well in the dark. Well, to me, that's not pre-symptomatic. That's a symptom. Clearly, night blindness is a symptom of inherited retinal disease, and so we would consider that a symptom. It would be worthwhile to consider some kind of testing. Now, maybe that testing actually is an evaluation with a retina specialist, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's genetic testing. I think there would be very few cases actually where we would say, now that you know your genetic test results, let's go straight to testing your child. There'd be very few. For the most part, we would want to have that child, in whatever circumstance, to be evaluated by a retina specialist first, have that conversation and make the determination of whether or not genetic testing is appropriate.
Thank you, Karmen. That was very good. So thank you once more to Kari and Karmen for their very informative presentations. It's been very interesting. Again, if you would like to learn more about this topic, please visit the Foundation's website, which is fightingblindness.org, and either choose the My Retina Tracker Registry tab or the Genetic Testing tab, and there you'll learn a lot more about genetic testing, about the registry. You'll also be able to find information about how to order the genetic test through your clinician. There's a download button to print a copy of a document that you can give your clinician if they're not aware of the program. And there's also a button there to download a document to explain more to you about the program we have. And again, if you would like to join the registry, you simply go to the myretinatrackerregistry.org, one word, myretinatrackerregistry.org. Thank you all very much. I hope you have a rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.